All right, here's the LS versus Cummins versus Powerstroke swap comparison on Ford Broncos. Ignore the mess on this Cummins swap. I'm putting a new steering box in and the shop's pretty dirty. So you want to do a swap and you can't decide if you want to do a Cummins, an LS, or a Powerstroke swap. Now, if you want to see these builds individually, I have videos that go over them in detail, but I'm just going to go over the basics on what's easiest, what's cheapest, and what makes the most sense. So, Cummins Bronco, did this swap a long time ago. Bronco used to be really nice, now it's getting pretty rusty. I did this swap with hand tools. Didn't take super long, but it could have been done a little better. This thing is dirty as hell because it's kind of my off-road toy. But this is a 12 valve Cummins. This is an industrial motor out of a FedEx truck, so it has a different manifold that kind of puts the turbo way lower, which is a necessity if you have an air conditioning box in this, which this one does. Otherwise, the turbo hits the box. This is paired with a 5-speed manual NV4500 from a Dodge and transfer case. Powerstroke Bronco is a 7.3 Powerstroke from a 97 Ford F350 automatic. Then there's the LS Bronco in this 95. This is a 2003 LQ460 motor, paired with a ZF5 5-speed. This was a factory 5-speed Bronco, but I put a ZF5 in it because they're tougher and they have a granny gear. Just for a note that the ZF5 directly replaces the M5OD, bolts in perfectly the same, everything's the exact same length, you don't need to change drive shafts or anything. So we'll start with the LS Bronco. The goal with this was to get this swap done for as cheap as possible. Doing this, I used ZF5 and I placed the motor and transmission in there with the transfer case on. And I want to do it cheap, so I didn't want to pay for drive shafts, so I located the transmission and the transfer case in the exact factory spot so I didn't have to change drive shafts, and then had the motor fit. This isn't done either. See, there's still some wires. It runs and drives. I've been driving it, but I'm just working out some little bugs here or there. Don't have the power steering fully bled yet. Kind of pain. But motor fits in there nice. This one's scooted back a little farther than you would normally do, mainly because I wanted the drive shafts to be the same length. If I was going with an automatic, I would have scooted it farther forward, but there's a pretty big gap. But I have no cooling or heating issues yet. No, it fits in there nice. Got a PSI harness for wiring. You can see that in my other vid. So really all I had to pay for this swap was a motor, wiring harness, and a few other things. Really was cheap. I had to buy an adapter plate to run this Ford transmission with this motor. I had to get the plate from Australia, so that costs a little more. It'd be really cheap if you had an automatic Bronco and wanted to just use a Chevy 4L80 or whatever. That would be a lot easier, but I wanted to keep it manual. Just has some Speed Engineering shorty headers. They fit in there really nice. Obviously I had to pay for exhaust to get done on it, but fits in there nice. Computer and everything's in the engine bay. Interior is still factory gauges, factory everything. I just wired it all to fit and work. I really do like the LS swap. These have 300 some horsepower from the factory. This has a small tune on it. Nothing crazy, but this Bronco scoots pretty quick for what it is. Starts up every time, no issues. I think total I have roughly 5,000 or 6,000 into it, maybe less. I didn't really keep track, but the motor I got a good deal for like 1,200, and the adapter was 700, and wiring harness was 650, and then a bunch of little fittings, you know, just to make everything work. But relatively cheap, relatively easy. Didn't have to do axles because it's, you know, light motor, not a ton of power, so kept the factory 5-lug half-ton axles. I did put an upgraded fuel pump in the tank, and I used the stock Ford lines, and I just adapted them, and for the fuel system they go to the Chevy. This one is drive-by pedal, so it has a cable. That was super easy. I just hooked the Chevy cable into the Ford gas pedal. Worked out nice. So the 7.3 Powerstroke Bronco. This was my first Powerstroke swap. A manual would have been nicer, but my donor truck was an auto, so I just used the auto. 5-speed would have been cool, but this works. This swap, as far as getting the motor in there and the trans, that's easy. All you need is a welder, and you got to make custom motor mounts. No one makes them, and that's not a big deal. You just, you know, set your motor in there at the right height you want, and then kind of weld up some tabs and whatnot. And I actually used the Ford factory Powerstroke mounts and just adapted them to fit this frame. No cutting of the cross member, no cutting of the firewall. It fits in there awesome. I did relocate the oil filter because they hang down pretty low, and we set this motor in kind of low, so my front axle may have hit the oil filter if you jumped it or flexed it out hard. So that's the only reason I relocated it. You don't have to do that. One thing you got to do with the automatic is upgrade your axles. I used the rear axle from the 97 Ford. It's a Sterling 10 1/4. I had to do that because it has a speed sensor in it, and the transmission needs a speed sensor to shift properly. I used the factory 97 Ford transfer case. Custom drive shafts. Those are about $1,000. Front end is a Dana 44 factory 79 Ford Bronco, but it's got 8-lug outers from early 70s big hub Dana 44. So that works out nice. You don't have to swap axles, just swap the outers. 7.3, you know, they're not super high horsepower, but they got a lot of torque. It's not fast by any means. This one's completely stock, not even a tune, but it's still, in this light Bronco, it's pretty quick for what it is. It's not as fast as the LS Bronco. The LS Bronco would destroy the 7.3 Bronco in a race, but off-roading, I would prefer the 7.3 just because you got low torque at low RPMs and you can crawl around. Gauge cluster in this, I just use the factory 97 Ford gauge cluster. Just kind of stuck it in there. Interior's not finished on this. I want to do more. I made a pretty quick ghetto center console to hold the shifter. You know, there's a million ways to do this. I don't have the ignition wired up, as you can see. It's still kind of just hanging here. But there's the computer for the motor. And I left a clutch pedal in here because this was a manual. Just in case the auto ever blows, and I'm going to swap it to a 5-speed just because I like manuals more than anything. But really straightforward swap. Wiring's the hardest part. Takes the longest. You know, this is all the factory wiring from the 97 Ford. Fuse box, IDM, everything for the motor. So if you have you have to get a complete donor truck if you want to do this. No one makes standalones, at least not that I know of. But it's really not that hard. I didn't really cut any wires or disconnect anything. You just hook up the grounds, hook up your batteries, hook up your power. Everything should fire up and it works and drives as it should. Cummins Bronco. I'm doing a major redo on some stuff right now. It has the little tires on it. She's getting pretty rusty. But again, this one, you don't need, well, this is a manual 5-speed, so you don't need a speed sensor. If you want a speedometer, you do, but this is a 10 1/4 from a 90s Ford back there. Front end's the same as the other one. Factory Dana 44 with 8-lug Chevy outers on this one. I found a Chevy axle in the junkyard, so you'll notice it's a little bit different than the Ford stuff, but it still bolts on. You just take everything from the knuckles out. So, you know, Chevy brake calipers and Chevy stuff, but still works just fine. Right now I'm putting a new steering box on because mine was leaking pretty bad. Been running this one for years. Never had any major issues. The Cummins 12 valve, you know, everyone knows about it, so I'm not going to go into that, but it's amazing. You know, they're reliable, all mechanical. These are super, super simple to wire. All you need is hook up a few wires. I'm not going to explain how because you can Google that, and there's really nice write-ups on that, but getting the motor in is a little more difficult than an LS or a Powerstroke. You do have to cut your cross member and notch it down a couple inches, and you do have to push the firewall back just a little bit. You just massage it with a big hammer, and then, you know, it'll fit fine. You can't really tell that it was hammered to hell. But once you do those minor adjustments, it fits in there well. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. You know, I didn't have, the way I did it, there wasn't room to run a mechanical fan, so I'm running 2 electrics. I am running an intercooler. You can kind of see it here. This is an intercooler from 2nd gen Dodge, and it's just flipped upside down. That way you can hook up your intercooler pipes, and it fits in there nice. You got to do a little trimming on the grill behind there. You don't have to do any transmission tunnel mods. The 5-speed NV4500 fits in there just fine. Kind of see it there. I'm running the Dodge transfer case in this one. Some people adapt it to run the 205, which is fine also. Haven't had any issues with this setup though. Again, you gotta kind of make a cross member. It doesn't have to be too fancy. This one's kind of ghetto, but it's worked all these years. Custom drive shafts, you know, $1,000 again. Drive shafts aren't cheap, and that's one thing a lot of people overlook on these builds is front and rear drive shafts are never cheap. But this one's got nice 4-inch exhaust, custom built out of other scrap exhaust pieces. This one is pretty juiced up. I got big injectors, bigger turbo. The injection pump is modded a little bit. This put down over 400 wheel horsepower. I forget the torque. It was like 800 or 900. It's up there. This thing is fun to drive. It's for as light as it is, it rips with all that torque, and it's pretty fun. This Bronco I have had on the scales when I had 37s on it. It weighs 6,200 pounds with bigger axles, the Cummins, and big tires, which still pretty light considering. I imagine the 7.3 Powerstroke is a little bit lighter, but not by much, just with this whole combo because the transmission's a little lighter in these. The gauges for the Cummins are easy. You can just put your stock Ford sensors into the Cummins block, and you know you'll want an aftermarket boost gauge and stuff. None of that's fancy, but this Bronco needs a lot of work. It's got a lot of wiring and stuff hanging out, factory wiring that's still there. I just never took it out. Really none of it's used anymore. And there's kind of some rat's nests from previous owners, random fog lights and stuff I just never had taken out. One thing to note with these big diesels is they're a lot heavier, so you gotta adjust your suspension to make it level. And what I've found with the Cummins and the Powerstroke is that if your truck was sitting level before with a gas motor, as soon as you put a diesel in, you lose 2 inches. So what I do is I just get 2-inch taller lift springs, and then they sit perfectly level, and they ride really nice. Honestly, these things ride like a cloud with all the weight. I see a lot of guys on the internet who haven't done these swaps. They're like, "Oh, I would never do that because it's just so heavy, and you know it would suck off road and all this." And honestly, it drives exactly the same as it did before. It off roads exactly the same. Hell, it might off road better because you have a little more weight. You might get more traction. But, you know, there's a lot of variables in that, so it can vary. But really, it's no different. It drives just the same. You just have a hell of a lot more power, hell of a lot more reliability, and hell of a lot better fuel mileage. This thing, if you drive it nice, which I don't, you can get into the 20 mile per gallon or so. I probably average like 15, and I drive it pretty aggressive. And that's a lot better than the 8 to 10 it used to get with a 400 motor it had. 7.3 Powerstroke, similar. You know, this one's pretty stock, so it just gets great fuel mileage always. The LS Bronco, I have not driven this very much yet, just because the power steering is not completely there yet. So I've only put like 150 or 200 miles on it, and so far I love it. It probably gets, over 15 miles per gallon. I'm not sure. My other LS swaps can get around 18. I would recommend the LS swap for any of these 90s Broncos. It fits in there nice. Guys do put 12 valve Cummins in there, and they fit nice too. But if you do that, you're gonna want to upgrade axles, and it's with these, you're gonna want to do a Dana 60 front. This TTB scissor axle thing, they're not super tough. They're fine for what I do with it and stock, but if you're going to do any off-roading or big-ass tires and a big diesel, you're probably going to want to upgrade it. Same with the rear end. This 8.8, they're not made to handle a ton of power and a ton of diesel torque. They're not the strongest thing, but in stock form, they work well. But the 10 1/4s in these Broncos, in the diesel Broncos, those things are tough. They last forever. They're super strong. A lot of nice lockers and gear options you can get for them. The 10 1/4 will bolt into this 90s Ford the same as these. Ford didn't really change any spring perch widths or anything. They just bolt right in. Makes it super easy for your axle swaps. Front axle, you gotta do a little bit of work. At the end of the day, if I only could have one swap and only drive one swap for the rest of my life, I'd probably go with the 12 valve Cummins, just because there's really no electronics. They're reliable. They make a lot of power for cheap. Powerstrokes can make a ton of power too, but they're pretty spendy to upgrade turbos and injectors, versus Cummins is pretty dirt cheap to make some serious power. Obviously, there's a ton of aftermarket for LS stuff, and you can make a crazy amount of power, but I kind of like things to be simple, easy to work on the side of the road. If the LS has some issues, you're going to have to hook up your code reader, HP tuners, and kind of figure out what's going on. Cummins is so simple. There's really not much going on. It's all mechanical. Not much can fail, and if it does, it's easy to diagnose and pretty easy to get parts for. I love my 7.3 Powerstrokes, but they have their own little wiring issues. There's a lot of sensors, ICP, IPR, a lot of little things. These guys like to fail the wiring harness that goes under the valve cover. And, I've had 7.3s a lot, and they run forever, but they do have kind of some wiring gremlins that show up often. And they're easy enough to fix, but they can be kind of hard to diagnose sometimes, IPR versus ICP, and it's hard to fix on the side of the road. You just don't, unless you carry all those sensors with you. The only thing about the diesels that I would say is a disadvantage over, say, an LS swap or hell, even a stock Ford Bronco gasser, is that sometimes they don't like to start in the winter as well, and they got to warm up. They take forever to warm up, but once they're warm, they're fine. Versus that, this thing will start -25, not plugged in all the time. These you kind of got to plug in at least if you want to start them and not have a violent startup. I would say if you're going to build the ultimate swapped Bronco or vehicle, I love my 79s and 78s, but they're getting hard to come by, and they're getting really expensive, and most of them are pretty rusty. But if I were to make the ultimate Bronco, I'd probably just grab a 90s one in good shape like this, put it on 3/4 ton or 1 ton axles, and put a 12 valve Cummins in with a 5-speed manual. Because then you get a nice newer interior. It's easy to get body panels for these still. You can find these Broncos relatively cheap and in decent condition compared to the 79s. I don't like automatics as much just because, they work, but they do fail. Manuals can fail also, but at least when, you can blow a gear out of a manual, and you usually still have some other gears that you can limp it home. No matter what swap you do, you gotta drop the tank, whether it's a diesel swap or a LS swap because you're gonna have to upgrade your fuel system, and at least in that. These, they have lift pumps on the motor. 7.3 has a lift pump on the motor, so you don't need to put a fuel pump in tank for these. They didn't come with one anyways, the 79s. So it's relatively easy. Just drop tank, drop the gas out, and then put it back in there and throw diesel in it and plumb a return line. But that's super easy. So no matter what swap you do, still gotta drop the tank. Still have to usually do a custom cross member for the transmission, not a big deal. In this case, I didn't have to, but for these you will. Now, the 7.3 Powerstroke cost to build, it kind of depends on your donor vehicle. I bought a Beater Ranch pickup at auction for $2,500, and that gives you almost everything you need. This this oil filter relocation kit was $500. And like I said, if you place your motor higher, you won't need to do that, so you'd save some money there. Drive shafts are $1,000. Same with that, $1,000. So, and then axle upgrades really can vary in price. The rear axle came from the donor vehicle, so that's nice. Front axle, you gotta find some junkyard parts or buy brand new. Same with this, the Cummins swap. I didn't have a donor vehicle for this one. I had just a motor, and then I had to piece everything else together, which made it really expensive. It's a lot cheaper if you buy a donor Dodge or whatever, because then you get a motor, you get a transmission, and you get all, some other little things that you'll need, like clutch hydraulics and all of that. But I've done 2 Cummins swaps, Powerstroke swap, and a few LS swaps, and a handful of other random swaps. And, it seems to be that the diesel swaps end up costing about $9,000 when you're done with them, including axles. I always go into these calculating out, and I'm like, oh, I could do the swap for $4,000. And yeah, that's never the case, because there's always little things that pop up that you need, and it adds up. And I always forget about drive shafts. Those are expensive. And the axles really can vary in price. But if you get a good deal on stuff, you could do these swaps pretty cheap, especially if you do all the labor yourself. The LS swap was definitely the cheapest, but, it's not as good as these diesel swaps, just because this doesn't have big upgraded axles. These are prone, it's just not as strong. These, you can off-road the crap out of and still drive them home. This thing is more of just a street Bronco. I don't off-road this one, but still, I think I have $5,000 or $6,000 into this thing, just with all the little doodads and stuff I had to buy and custom order. But again, if I was to do any swap in any Bronco, I would definitely go with a 90s Bronco with a 12-valve Cummins manual. It's just simple, it works. It's probably the cheapest way to have a really nice Bronco that's swapped. So yeah, as far as installation goes, it's just, no swap is easy. I see swaps all the time, mainly Cummins swaps on the internet, that people attempt to start and they just never finish because it's way more work than they thought or way more money. But if you plan it out, buy a donor truck, you save a ton. I have hardly seen any 7.3 Powerstroke swaps yet. It's just not as common because you can't buy the parts. You got to custom make motor mounts and all that. That is the nice thing about these, is you can buy motor mounts, so you don't have to fab any up, but you still do have to cut a cross member and make some other little parts. You got to have a welder and some skill. Really, time is the big thing. These swaps don't take 2 weeks. They could if you did it, worked on them 24/7, but they take time. If you want to do it slow, do it right. So if you're thinking about a swap, I'd probably still do a Cummins swap over anything, because I'm more of a Cummins guy. It's just parts are more available, and it's probably the best bang for your buck. If you want to see individual videos of these builds, walk-arounds with more detail, there's more videos in my channel, and then There's quite a few videos of this thing snow wheeling, this thing rock crawling, snow wheeling, doing all sorts of stuff. I don't have many videos of this one yet just because I don't have it complete, so more videos will come of that. But yeah, if you have more questions, I really don't look at comments on YouTube, but you can find my Instagram, and that's probably the best way if you have any specific questions on what motor you want to swap in or any questions on how to do certain things. So, thanks for watching my video.